Hello everyone and welcome to this first athletes webinar of 2021. Today the topic is COVID-19 and clean sport update. So thank you very much for joining us from wherever you are in the world, and it's a pleasure to have you here. This is one of a number of webinars that we've had focused on providing information to athletes, and it's the second one that we've done on COVID-19. The first webinar we did last year was on COVID-19, and we thought it would be a good idea to start off 2021 with an update because we have been getting lots of questions about COVID and in particular about vaccines. So I'm joined today by three fantastic speakers who will be talking to you about a range of topics to do with COVID and anti-doping and their personal experiences and what's happening in the world at the moment. So we have Dr. Olivier Raban, who is the Senior Executive Director of Sciences and International Partnerships at WADA and has a long history in anti-doping and in pharmaceuticals. We also have Dr. Lenka Wench, who is a three-time Olympian, rowing world champion. She's a member of WADA's Health and Medical Research Committee and also a member of the World Rowing Council and has been a long-time athlete rep as well. We then have James Slater from the International Paralympic Committee, and he's the Director of Anti-Doping there, also with a long history in anti-doping, started off in Canada, and has been involved with a number of major events and also setting up a number of initiatives within anti-doping. So between the four of us, we will be hosting this webinar today. I'm Ben Sanford, I'm the chair of the WADA Athlete Committee, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. Just going to start off with some housekeeping. We really do encourage you to ask questions today. There's a questions tab which should be on your GoToWebinar panel, and so please go to that, type in the question that you would like asked. We're going to be talking for about 15 or 20 to 30 minutes, and then we want to have as much time for questions as possible, and so hopefully we'll be able to wrap up the webinar in an hour. So hopefully 30 minutes of us talking and then 20 to 30 minutes of answering your questions. The webinar will be recorded, and so if you want to pass the webinar on to someone in the future, you can go to the WADA website and get the link and give the link to anyone you want, and we'll definitely encourage you to do that. A quick note on WADA's privacy policy. So WADA will not use personal information for any direct marketing or unsolicited follow-up unless you have first been informed of and expressly consented to this use. And there'll also be a survey that you will get at the end of the webinar, and we would really encourage you to fill in the survey so we can improve what we do next time. So that's the housekeeping and the introductions. So what we thought that we would start off by doing is just giving you some background on anti-doping and COVID-19. And so I've just got a short presentation for you, which I'll sort of walk you through, because it's important that we set the scene for why we are here now and what has happened in the last year. So about this time last year, COVID-19 hit us, and it really came out of the blue. No one in the world would have expected that the world would have been shut down because of a pandemic, and COVID-19 has had an enormous impact on our societies, on our communities, and as a result of that, it's had a huge impact on sport. And because of the impact on sport and the approach of governments to really concentrate on looking after people's health, it's also had a big impact on anti-doping. So obviously, if sporting events can't be taking place, then there's going to be a reduction in testing, because that in-competition testing can't be happening as well. And our approach to this from WADA's point of view and across the board, I'd say from anti-doping, has very much been a health-first approach. Making sure that the information that we're giving, the recommendations that WADA is putting out, is focused primarily on health first, and then sport and anything else second. And that would be one of the takeaways I'd hope from today's webinar as well, is that the primary thing that you should be looking after first of all is your health. So, in the last year we've had, depending on where you are in the world, we've had a lot of lockdowns or continuous lockdowns or variations of lockdowns. We've had sports stopped. We've had, and this has obviously resulted in a reduction in testing. So if we're not having events, we can't have in-competition testing. And then if there are lockdowns, then anti-doping organizations obviously can't go out and test you at the same time. Major events have been postponed, and this has caused a huge amount of uncertainty and disruption to your training and your competition schedules. We've had the Olympics and the Paralympics postponed to this year, and James will be able to talk a lot more about what the IPC has been doing in this regard and how this has affected the IPC moving things from 2020 to 2021. And obviously this is all completely new territory for us, and this is one of the things that we've been dealing with in anti-doping. None of us thought that we would be dealing with a pandemic and suddenly be having to look at reductions in testing and what the possible consequences of that, moving major events. So there's been a lot of work that's gone on behind the scenes to make sure that programs have been able to continue, and that we continue to also develop and maybe also innovate at the same time. Salva, can you change the screen? Thanks. I just wanted to also touch on athlete concerns over the last year. Like I said at the beginning, this is the second webinar we've done focused on COVID-19. And the questions that we've been getting within the wider athlete committee have also changed a lot in the last year. So, and these are just some of the examples of the questions that we were getting a year ago. This is actually a slide from the presentation we gave a year ago. So, will athletes be able to use lockdowns to dope? Treatments for COVID? Can I still be tested if I'm in lockdown? What if I refuse a doping control because I'm sick or because I live with someone who's sick? And so these questions have really changed. Now we're getting a lot more questions around vaccines, whether vaccines are going to be the result of giving you a positive test or not, around your health, and also around the upcoming Olympics and Paralympics. So I haven't had anyone ask me around whether athletes are doping during lockdowns for quite a while now, and the focus has really changed. Salva, next slide. Oh, and I should say that Salva is our technical person who's helping us in the background. So if you hear me referring to Salva, it's Salva who's organizing all of this. And our responses to athletes over the last year. And obviously the last year has been very disruptive. There has been a lot of uncertainty. And so we've tried to, as much as possible, give some certainty to you and to athletes around the world. So as a result of this, we've put out 3 question and answer documents, and the latest one from us just went out in the last week. So you can go to WADA's website and you can download and have a look at the COVID-19 athlete Q&A. And if there are any questions you have as a result of reading through that, please contact us, and we're more than happy to assist. We obviously had a webinar on this. Sorry, back a slide, Salva. We had a webinar on COVID-19 last year, which had 900 people signed up. And then today's webinar has also got over 1,000 people signed up. So there's a lot of interest in COVID-19 and how it's affecting all of us in the anti-doping space. And the last point I wanted to touch on is, I've spoken briefly about the lockdowns and how this reduced testing, and the next slides will show some numbers. But there have been, a number of anti-doping organizations which have developed quite innovative ways to test athletes during the lockdowns. And we'll sort of circle back to this at the end, and I'd be, really keen to get your input either in this webinar or, via email afterwards about what you as athletes think about this, or if you have ideas about how we could develop testing in the future as well. Salva, next slide. Actually, skip that one. So the next part is just on testing data. So this is a graph. There's a number of things going on in this graph. But if you look at the fat green bars, those are the number of samples in 2019. The fat grey bars are the number of samples being taken in 2020. So you can see that 2020 started off in January and February with more samples being taken than in 2019. And then when COVID hit in March and April and May, there was a really dramatic drop off as lockdowns took effect, as sports stopped. We saw that there was no or very little in competition testing, and anti-doping organisations just physically were not allowed to go out and collect samples to anywhere near the degree that they were in 2019. So the black line that you see there is the number of testing authorities, so anti-doping organisations that were testing. So you also see in 2019 it's a green line, and so you have a high number of anti-doping organisations in 2019 that are testing, and then especially in April this has drastically dropped off. But you also see throughout 2020 the numbers starting to get back to normal as things gradually improved with 2019 and with COVID-19, or we got used to dealing with it or working around it as lockdowns were lifted and as sport came back. So yeah, a number of things happening on this graph. The main takeaway I would say was that there was a reduction in testing, but we started to see that coming back later in the year. But then you can see there's a slight drop off again in sort of November and December, where countries started entering sort of second lockdowns as a second wave of COVID hit, especially over the northern winter. Onto the next and last slide. So this is the level of out of competition sample collection between October 2020 and December 2020 versus October 2019 and December 2019. So not in competition testing, just out of competition testing. And you'll see that the numbers actually in October, November, December aren't drastically different. So I wanted to just show this to say, that there has been, quite an amazing recovery from sort of April, where testing really dropped off. So we are back to, in December 2020, we were doing 90% compared to 2019. So it's not back to 100%, but there is testing, and it's anti-doping organisations have learnt how to operate with COVID-19 to a large degree, and countries have also adapted as well. So those are some of the numbers, and happy to answer any questions about the numbers when we come to the question and answers. So Salva, you can close that down. And yeah, next, that sort of gives you some background, hopefully sets the scene for a little bit of this webinar. And now I'd like to hand it over to Olivier Raban to talk more about COVID-19 and vaccines and anti-doping. Over to you, Olivier.
Thank you, Ben. Good day, everyone. I hope you can hear me well from Montreal. As Ben mentioned, I am Olivier. I'm the person in charge of Water with the science. I'm certainly very pleased to be with you today to this webinar and discuss this COVID-19 vaccine and anti-doping topic of the day. As you can imagine, this is a fairly complex topic, but I would like to cover it in a few minutes, at least to give some background and tell you where we're coming from, what kind of reasoning we applied when this pandemic started, and when we looked into the different therapeutic options to deal with COVID-19. Certainly, if we difficult, I think, to talk about vaccines, they are talking about immunity. And let's be very clear, nobody can live normally with a good immunity. It's one of the main natural protection that all of us have against external infection, all sorts of foreign organisms. So this is absolutely essential. And we can distinguish two forms of immunity. What is called the innate immunity, the innate immune defense. All of us are born with, or were born with. Or in the very early years, were transferred part of it from a mother during breastfeeding. So this is really also in our early years.
Sorry, Olivier, I might just interrupt you for a second.
Right?
Yeah, your sound is not very good. Salva, do we have any sort of workaround? Would it help if he turned off his video?
Olivier, exactly, Olivier, I'll be in touch with you if we can move on to a different speaker for the time being.
Yep, sure. Yeah, so we'll come back to Olivier and we'll just jump ahead a little bit here. We were going to go to Linka next, but maybe James, if we could skip Linka for now, because I think it'll flow quite well if Linka sort of talks after Olivier. Would you be able to just sort of talk us through what's been happening with the IPC and how you guys are doing preparing for Tokyo 2020 and also Beijing next year?
Sure. Thanks, Ben. Yeah, I feel like I'm the odd person out here. I'm neither an athlete nor a doctor, so I'm the only one. I feel a little like I don't belong, but just in terms of, just as an introduction to the International Paralympic Committee as an anti-doping organization, we have two main roles, which is pretty interesting probably for the group because we're a major event organizer, so we're the organizer of the Paralympic Games. And as well, we're an international federation for 10 sports. So we manage anti-doping programs year round in competition and out of competition. So we have a really good outlook as to what's going on COVID related. So I'll just talk about, especially in our role as an international federation, just the impact that it's had on our testing program. So obviously, last year when the pandemic hit and everyone really didn't know what was going on, many parts of the world were in lockdown. So testing basically stopped for us for probably 2 or 3 months. We weren't really open about that. We didn't announce it like some other anti-doping organizations did, but we didn't stop on purpose. It was more that our service providers were just not able to safely collect samples. We probably towards the end of spring into the summer of last year, we were able to ramp up our testing program. And by the end of the year, I would say that in almost every country, our testing program was almost back up, out of competition testing was back up to 100%. Unfortunately, we didn't host very many competitions in 2020. So, and the IPC, like many anti-doping organizations, depend on the local organizing committees to pay for those tests. So there definitely was a drop in testing for in competition, and it was unfortunate because we depend on those tests to test athletes that are not part of an out of competition testing pool, either at the national or international level. So that was a bit problematic for 2020, but from our point of view for 2021, our competitions had started up again. We're testing at them the way that we normally would, at the levels that we normally would, and you know, we were able to, because we had kind of the downtime of testing, we were able to do some interesting things towards the end of the year with our testing program. You know, obviously our tests are unannounced always, but we were able to do some surprising things that athletes had never seen before in terms of testing in short periods of time and things like that. And we did have some success in catching potential anti-doping rule violations. We had some AAFs. So that leads us kind of into our second role as the major event organizer. We're obviously, it's going to be a busy year for us. We're heading into Tokyo now, and then almost immediately after Tokyo is over, we're going full bore into Beijing mode. So it's going to be very busy for us. I can say that, in the lead up to Tokyo, we work very closely with the International Testing Agency, who manage programs on behalf of many of the able-bodied federations, and as well manage the Olympics on behalf of the IOC. So we work very closely with them. I know that they are doing their best to work with the national anti-doping organizations to ensure that Tokyo-bound athletes are being tested and that testing gaps are being filled. The IPC will be doing that as well for the Paralympics. So we will be sending out, testing plans to national anti-doping organizations to suggest that they, test athletes that maybe have been missed up until now. So one other area specific to the Paralympic athletes that's been of interest during the COVID time, many national anti-doping organizations who, because of local health ordinances, were not able to collect samples in athletes' homes as they usually would. We're using alternate methods of collecting samples, and for the Paralympic athlete population, some of those alternate methods proved problematic. So athletes with visual impairments may not be able to read on the screen. If the information was sent by computer, if it didn't match their kind of reading software, that could be problematic. And as well, if an athlete typically would depend on a doping control officer or a representative to assist them with the doping control process, that also could be problematic. So that's something that we're looking at closely, and we're working with the national anti-doping organizations affected. So Tokyo itself, really for the Olympics and Paralympics, anti-doping planning has not changed at all. The planning is exactly what we had planned. For if the games had been held in 2020, there hasn't been a reduction in testing. There are no plans to test fewer athletes pre-competition or in competition. Obviously, we will be following safety guidelines and the WADA guidelines on testing during the COVID pandemic, but besides that, it will be really testing as normal, and Tokyo-bound athletes can assume that the anti-doping program will be exactly the same as in past games, if not maybe even better. So that's good news. I will mention one thing. There was you had a slide up on your slide before, was if I feel sick, can I refuse testing? And I think many anti-doping organizations were more flexible about whether or not that was a failure to comply, over the last year and a half, and rightly so, because we want to protect doping control officers, we want to protect athletes' health. But during the games, it definitely will be a failure to comply if you say, if a doping control officer comes to your room and says, notifies you for doping control, and you say, oh, I'm feeling kind of sick, I can't take a test right now. Well, that's not going to be an adequate answer, because every athlete, at the minute that they feel like they may not be feeling well, have to go and get tested, have to go to the clinic, and check to make sure that they're not COVID positive, because obviously we want keep the athletes' villages as safe as possible. So yeah. So if you say that I'm sick in Tokyo, then automatically we will start the procedure to determine whether or not there's a failure to comply there. So we would just warn athletes about that leading into the games. But other than that, we are, we're ready. Tokyo is ready. The lab is ready. And it's going to be business as usual, anti-doping wise at the games. So back to you, Ben.
Yeah, thanks a lot, James. That's really good, and some really good points in there, which I think provide a lot of certainty in what have been quite uncertain times. So, and it's really good to see that the anti-doping programs are back up and running, and that the programs that you have in place for the Paralympics will be as strong or better than normal. So thanks a lot for that. We're going to try and go back to Olivier in Montreal and see if Montreal's managed to fix the internet. Over to you, Olivier, again.
Thank you, Ben. And sorry again, it's not only humans face bugs, but obviously computers as well. So this is part of a modern era, I would say. So yeah, let's go back to where I was talking about immunity and the innate immunity. We're all born. We were all born. And also now the acquired immunity, which particularly when we're exposed to external viruses or bacteria, and the immune system learns to recognize them and block them. And this is a very natural process for all human beings to be exposed to external pathogens and having the possibility to react to those. Also, another dimension came with the understanding of science and medicine, which has been to expose beings to external organisms, pathogens. And this is how the vaccines have been created more than 200 years ago to boost this acquired immunity by exposing us to diverse or infectious organisms that would be normally deadly to humans. The principle is basically to teach your immune system to inactivate those organisms. And are usually taken, from the bacteria you're potentially exposed to, inactivate them or break them, and you inactivate infectious pathogen.
Sorry, Olivier. Yeah, we're still struggling to hear you properly.
I think it has to do with internet connection.
Yeah, we might. Salva, do we want to turn Olivier's video off to see if just the audio will work?
Yeah, sure.
Or unless you have a better way to. Okay, let's try this.
Okay, I can try. I can try with the video off. And so the principle is to expose our immune system to inactivated organisms or fractions of such organisms, as I was mentioning, to train your immune system to recognize and block those pathogenic agents very quickly. Now, you could wonder whether letting a natural response occur. Well, simply because it takes a few days to train our immune system to produce antibody against the infection, a sufficiently strong response to efficiently block an infection. So it is better in terms of health strategy to expose our body, to train our body to the infectious agent, and in fact, it's an immediate response. And in our daily life, we're exposed to such infectious organisms. To train your immune system, you've got vaccines that have been developed. And I think, for example, about all vaccines against smallpox, tetanus, or hepatitis. And more recently, there are more recent ones that have been developed against Ebola, and still some in development against, for example, AIDS or malaria. Many of us, and maybe all of us, have already been vaccinated against some of those common infectious diseases. With COVID-19, we are facing a new respiratory disease, a severe acute respiratory syndrome, acronym SARS, which is due to an infection by a coronavirus, a virus, in fact, that looks like a crown or a corona under a microscope. And since this is the second time one of those coronaviruses triggering a SARM, this respiratory syndrome, has been identified, it was named number 2. So we've got the SARS-CoV-2, which is the infectious agent we're all talking about. So what is new? In fact, what is not new about SARS and COVID-19 and the coronavirus, these elements are not new, but the approach that has been taken by some scientists to develop vaccines against SARS-CoV-2 is new in a sense, because instead of using the usual approach of, as I said, taking a virus and inactivate the virus or take a fraction of it to select the, the elements you want to develop or train your immune system against, in fact, this time the scientists have selected the genetic sequence that codes for a surface protein called the spike that allows the virus to enter human cells. So the genetic sequence of this protein in the form of a messenger RNA is encapsulated in lipid nanoparticles, so small droplets, if you will, of lipids, of fat components, and enters human cells to use the human cell machinery to produce a viral surface protein and train your immune system to recognize this protein. So if and when the natural virus enters your body, your immune system is already trained to recognize the virus and block it immediately before it can enter your cells and replicate to create an infection. So in fact, this is the mechanism supporting this, this approach. And as I said before, vaccines are not new. The use of mRNA vaccines, such as the Moderna and Pfizer-BioNTech vaccines, are new in essence. Other vaccines, such as the AstraZeneca or Sputnik, which are based on non-replicant adenoviruses, which contain the sequence of the SARS-CoV-2, are not so new either. So, in fact, why are we not worried about these new vaccines? Well, first and foremost, I would say because vaccines are not new in essence, as I described, and are extremely efficient to control and eradicate infectious diseases. From a healthcare perspective, they are absolutely essential tools. The second element is that nothing is different in principle with these vaccines against COVID-19, but since mRNA vaccines are new, we wanted to do our due diligence and we looked carefully into those vaccines and the science supporting them, as well as exchanging with some of the manufacturers to collect additional information. So let's be very clear. With close to 340 vaccine projects around the world, 66 in clinical trials as of last month, and about 14 already approved around the world, we cannot look into all of them. But what we did, we looked into the new and leading ones that are currently being widely distributed. First of all, let me reassure you all that those vaccines, like all preceding vaccines, are not considered to be doping substances or methods. I know well that the prohibited list refers to the prohibition of genetic material, but that does not apply to the vaccines, even when they are based on DNA or RNA, such as the Pfizer, BioNTech, and the Moderna vaccines. Secondly, the excipients or reagents that are contained in those vaccines are usually taken from the standard list of reagents, already pre-registered by regulatory health authorities. So we did not find any excipient in the composition of those vaccines that would contravene the prohibited list. Again, we are safe from this point. So based on the above, science is conclusive that these vaccines will have no effect for athletes subject to drug testing. However, what we wanted to do is to demonstrate in the real world that absolutely no interference existed with immunoassays in it. We initiated a study that is currently ongoing, in progress, to reinforce our field knowledge, mainly, I would say, to prevent any athlete to invoke the vaccination as an excuse for a positive anti-doping test. So to conclude, and in a nutshell, this is to share this information with you today, reinforce the message that vaccines are essential tools in preventing spreading of infectious diseases, and that we have no particular concern at WADA from any anti-doping perspective with those vaccines currently being used against COVID-19. So over to you, Ben, and I'd like to take questions, if any, at the end of our session. Thank you.
You're on mute, Ben.
Sorry, everyone. Thanks a lot, Olivier. Thanks, Linka. I was just saying that you got a lot clearer sort of halfway through your presentation there. Sort of once you started talking about COVID, everything started to clear up. So if anyone does have any, I know that it still wasn't, crystal clear. If anyone does have any questions about what Olivier was saying, please type those in and we can answer those at the end. But the main takeaways there are that vaccines are essential tools, and that WADA from an anti-doping perspective doesn't have any concerns about the vaccines, and that it's, they are an essential part of the response to COVID-19. And also one of the things that I found interesting was that, there are 314 vaccines around the world in development, which is a lot of vaccines. And also, that the work that WADA is doing on this is, part of that is to make sure that athletes can't claim that a certain vaccine is the result or the reason why they've tested positive. So thank you very much, Olivia, and please, everyone, ask us questions about what has just been said. Linka, I wanted to come to you next. I thought it was quite a good segue from one doctor to another doctor, and also the fact that you have been an athlete, you are an athlete representative, you're on WADA's Health, Medical and Research Committee, and you've had COVID, you've had the vaccine. I was just wondering if you could sort of talk about, your perspective on this, what you're hearing from athletes, and any, concerns or messages that you'd like to get across.
Yes, thank you, Ben. Yes, as you said, I've had both COVID. I don't know where I acquired it. I had fairly mild symptoms of a cough and fever and pain of the muscles. No, nothing. It had to be treated. No pneumonia. So I was lucky. I had a relatively mild form. But I think, despite of that, the recommendation is still to take the vaccination. So I did that, and I was vaccinated with the BioNTech Pfizer vaccine, which was fine. It had some effects which were desired because it showed that my immune system reacted in a positive way, and there was like I was tired and I had some pain, basically a little bit of a fever and a headache, but that's good. I think from an athlete's perspective, there are two things. One is, from what I'm hearing, is how do I return to sport once I had COVID, the COVID infection? And the second one is, when should I take the vaccine? Is it safe? Is it okay? Will it disturb my performance? And I think for the first part, there are some guidelines from the sports medicine societies around the world which clearly state an algorithm how you return to sport once you had the COVID infection, and it depends on whether you were symptomatic or asymptomatic, whether you had pneumonia or not, or whether you had a myocarditis. And so there's exactly when you had symptoms, yes, but no pneumonia, there's recommended resting and exercise, ECG, lab works and everything. So I won't go into details, but I think once an athlete had a positive test and maybe symptoms, it's really important that that athlete gets in touch with her or his doctor and follows that route through testing and lab works and ECGs, and then in the end will be declared fit to continue with their exercise, because we don't know a lot at the moment about the side effects, the long-term effects, and it's really, really important that athletes are really checked up before they undergo their normal exercise, normal training regimen. So that's sort of one thing that has to be taken into account. As for the vaccination, usually the first vaccination is tolerated quite well. When you have the refreshment, the second shot, then you have to expect some reactions to that vaccination. So probably my recommendation, if you can time that, would be that you had especially the second vaccination, but also the first one in a week where you have maybe just light training or no training at all, and not just before a competition or not before some selection process or selection tests you're having, because your performance might be affected by the normal immune reaction. As Olivier said, like your body is reacting to that particle, and when it's reacting, it shows, and it's a good thing, but it's probably not a good thing to train on that.
Thanks, Lenka. That's really, really helpful and good information to have. From a rowing perspective, how's rowing been dealing with the pandemic and COVID-19? I imagine that events have been stopped and
yes.
And selection criteria is still in play for Tokyo?
Yes, I mean, last year, like everyone, no one really knew what's going on, what the infection routes were, how to protect participants and those people who are running the regattas from COVID. So basically, last year we cancelled almost everything, and then started slowly towards fall to have a couple of regattas without spectators, with very strict health measurements and strict measures against the spreading of the virus. Athletes were held in a bubble, and there was a lot of disinfection and distancing at the regatta places. And so we tested that during the European competition, and it worked really well. We didn't have any serious outbreaks, which gave us as a federation quite a confidence that regattas can be held in a safe way, that athletes can be safe during our events. And yes, qualification, like in every other sport, was postponed because we just want to make sure that every athlete can row and compete in a healthy environment without any risk to their health or the entourage's health. And also we need to make sure that everyone can actually travel to the regatta or to the competition site, because I think that's one of the major restrictions now, is the freedom of movement. Like some countries require a long quarantine upon arrival or when coming back, and so it's still very difficult, but we're quite confident. We have set dates for qualification regattas, and hopefully we'll manage that everyone gets their fair chance to participate in those regattas.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's really helpful. Yeah, I'm just building on that point that you make at the end. COVID is affecting different countries in different ways, and will continue to do so for a time yet. And as we've seen there, different countries are responding with different health measures as well. And so that's obviously having an effect on athletes around the world in a different way. And we've seen that also in anti-doping and the health requirements that doping control officers have to follow when they're collecting samples from athletes. So if you're an athlete out there and you're used to what the situation is in your country at the moment, just be aware that when you are traveling to events in other countries or to major events, the health requirements will quite possibly be different than what you're used to as well. They might be less, they might be more, but anti-doping organizations do have to follow the local health requirements. So just please be aware of that. Moving on to that's our sort of presentations from the four of us. So we'll now flick into question and answer mode, and we've got 15 minutes where we can go through some of the questions that have been asked. And again, like if you want to ask a question, just open up the question panel and type in a question there, and hopefully we'll get to it. The first one I wanted to start with is a question that comes up quite a bit, and it's will vaccines be compulsory? So James, you might want to touch on this one.
Sure, and I probably should have talked about this earlier. Apologies for not. So vaccinations will not be compulsory. The planning that the IOC, the IPC, Tokyo 2020 are conducting, the playbooks are which have been published, the COVID playbooks, and I recommend that there's different ones for different groups of people that are going to the games, but athletes should definitely be reading the athlete playbook. It's available for download on the IPC website and the IOC website and the Tokyo 2020 website. So I would suggest that, but the playbook is written with the assumption that no one will be vaccinated coming in, and we know that won't be true. We know that a percentage of athletes will be vaccinated, but the precautions are being taken based on no one being vaccinated. So vaccinations are not mandatory, and there will not, we don't anticipate vaccinations happening in Tokyo either. So so at this point, all of our planning is based on people, athletes, officials, NOC, NPC staff coming in unvaccinated.
Yeah, thanks, James. And again, just to highlight what James said there, there is the athlete playbook, and I definitely recommend that you have a look at the athlete playbook. It's got some really helpful information about how the Olympics and Paralympics are going to be run, and what the health requirements are going to be, what happens if you get sick, and all the procedures that you're going to have to follow, not just from an anti-doping perspective, but right across the games themselves. So please have a look at that, and I think the IOC and IPC will be updating that as we get closer to the games as well. Okay, next question. Where was it? There's a question about, Linky, you touched on this, that COVID-19 can have quite long-term consequences for some individuals. And the question here is around the treatment that those individuals might be getting for those sort of, for either COVID, if it's immediate, or those long-term effects, and whether any of those treatments, whether it's with anti-inflammatories or something else, would return an ADRV. Olivia, you might have something to say on, Linky, you might as well, on the sort of the treatments of COVID and whether athletes should be concerned if they develop COVID.
Linky, do you want to go first, or do you want me to
No, you go ahead.
Okay.
That's okay.
Well, at the medicines that are approved for doping, there are not so many. That's been one of the big disappointments, I would say, from modern pharmacology. Even with the antiretroviral substances, nothing worked very well. The only substance, I would say two maybe, the first one, which is natural, which is oxygen supplementation, which is not prohibited. So this is not an issue. And usually people will require oxygen supplementation will hardly train at their normal level. So nothing to worry about here anyway. The only substance and class of substances that could be of concern would be glucocorticosteroids, in particular dexamethasone, that has been used. But again, it's been recommended only when people are in intensive care units. to prevent the inflammatory cascade that some patients, people might face when they are really in a critical phase of expansion of the infection. So certainly not something that would be compatible, first of all, with training, and glucocorticoids anyway are prohibited out of competition. In competition only. So since you would be taking them out of competition in a hospital setting, there is nothing to worry about. So purely from a prohibited list perspective, there is nothing to worry about. There is no particular need for a therapeutic exemption, not for the vaccine, nor for any of the treatments today that could be proposed for COVID-19 infection.
Yes, I don't really have a lot to add to that. I think if you have a sort of a mild infection, you can take whatever alleviates the pain, like non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, like ibuprofen or something, which is not on the list, but definitely go to your doctor and check with the list. That's my recommendation. As usual, as everything an athlete does, it has to make sure every individual has to make sure that they're not taking or not given anything which is on the list.
Thanks, Olivia. Thanks, Linka. James, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think Linka just nailed it on the head there. It's absolutely there are possibilities of medications being taken, and you should treat it the same way that you would treat any other time that you need to take a medication. You need to check with your physician, you need to check the list, and if you need a TUE, you need to get it. We did see one emergency use of diuretics because of a cardiac issue related to COVID, which was kind of surprising for us. We weren't expecting that, and that was an emergency retroactive use, and the athlete received a TUE. So really, it comes down to the rules haven't changed, and just follow the rules the way you normally would.
Thanks. Probably it's coming through a little bit in the questions that everyone is asking us here. Probably the two biggest questions that we've been getting from athletes are, if I take the vaccine, will I test positive? Will I return an ADRV? I think we've answered that one reasonably well. But the next one, which we have that's coming up, is around will getting the vaccine, will it affect an athlete's performance or their health? And therefore, should they be getting the vaccine at all? I don't know if Link has touched on this a bit, but do any of you want to have a go at answering the sort of concern that comes up around whether being vaccinated is going to affect someone's body or health or performance?
If I may, I think Olivier said it when he explained about like how vaccination works, and that this is the acquired immune reaction, and that's what they're doing. So they're actually helping the body along to develop an immunity against COVID. And so for a short term, as I said, for 48 hours after the vaccination, you might feel ill or uncomfortable, and your performance levels might drop. But that's only due because your immune system is really active and really reacting to the vaccine and trying to build as many immune competitive cells to fight COVID or fight the disease. This is not going to have any long-term effect on performance, just the short-term effect where your immune system is really active, where you shouldn't overtrain, you shouldn't really strain yourself. So I'm really comfortable that there won't be any long-term effects from the vaccination, only positive long-term effects.
Yeah, maybe adding to what Lenka is saying, I mean, from the health risk perspective, you are taking more risk by being exposed to the natural virus and to the COVID-19 disease, which can have some long-term effects. We know even for some young people in the 20s and 30s, some of them have long-term symptoms following a COVID-19 infection. So you are certainly taking less risk with a vaccination that you would normally do, being exposed to the natural virus. Between the two, frankly, I mean, the vaccination is certainly a very good option.
Yeah, thanks. I think those are really key points. That, you know, the risk of having COVID-19 is far worse than any small risk of, you know, health issues with a vaccine, and it's very much a health first approach. So yeah, I think we would all encourage you to get the vaccine and get vaccinated, and you know, also if we all do that, then hopefully we can end this pandemic sooner rather than later. There's a few other questions coming up around officials, and will officials be vaccinated, or how has this worked so far? And just from, you know, from what I've seen, different anti-doping organizations have taken different approaches in this regard, and so some have been testing their doping control officers, you know, quite regularly. Like one of the biggest fears from anti-doping organizations was that they would have their doping control officers going out to test athletes, and the doping control officer would be positive and then infect the athlete. So this was an enormous concern from anti-doping organizations, and a lot of work went into, you know, ensuring that they were either getting regularly tested or putting in health and safety procedures to make sure that, you know, the chance of them, if they were asymptomatic, to, you know, the chance of them passing anything on was, you know, greatly reduced. And you also saw this through the alternative sample collection procedures that, you know, some anti-doping organizations put in place. Do any of you want to? Are there any special things which I've missed in talking about that, James? Maybe like, are you guys doing anything special with your doping control officers or testing? Or?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the doping control officers for our like year-round program don't come from one organization or one company. We use multiple, so we ensure that certain you know, we're trying to mitigate the risks as much as possible. But what I can say for Tokyo, for instance, is that the plan is not to make it mandatory for you know, DCOs or, you know, even you know, sport officials, you know, referees and things like that. But there definitely is a very serious testing plan set out for them that's going to be set up in Tokyo. And DCOs, sport officials, will be tested on a regular basis during the games, as well as the athletes.
Thanks. That probably closes off. It's coming up to an hour, and so we can probably end things on that note. Did any of you want to have any last words before we close this webinar off?
Well, maybe just to say that for all of us, there is a certain element of fatigue with this pandemic. I think we're all feeling it. We would all like to return to normality. But frankly, with the speed at which some vaccines have been developed, we can be reasonably confident that we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. And as vaccination spreads around the world, that will be certainly the sign of a return to normality for all of us. So I think we should remain optimistic, even if the times are a bit complicated for many of us. It's a matter of time, and I think that certainly all of us want to see the Tokyo Olympic Games going on, because there could be a very strong sign of revival, not only for the athletes, but for humanity as a whole.
Thanks, Olivier. Well said. On that note, there's just one last thing that I'd like to cover, and then we can close things off. And I mentioned this in the slides at the beginning. We saw when COVID was at its height, and we had a lot of lockdowns, we saw a number of anti-doping organizations develop alternative sample collection procedures. Some of these were done remotely, some of them were done in minivans. Some of them were done online with the sample kits being sent out to athletes. But most athletes would be very familiar with the standard sample collection procedure. You know, someone comes to your house or after an event, they accompany you during the process, and you give a sample and they take the sample away to get tested. But WIDA's set up a working group to look at you know, how we could develop things and evolve things in the future, if we've learned anything from the pandemic around, you know, I can't even say this word, innovative procedures, and what new things we could develop. And I'd be really interested to hear from athletes in particular around if you have any, you know, great ideas around how we could, you know, develop sample collection in the future. Obviously, we have new technologies. You know, we're all working in a virtual world now. So if you have a think about it, and then, you know, in the either the survey that you're going to get immediately after this, or you can contact me at any time, and you can do that through WIDA. You know, be really interested to know, like, what new testing requirements or alternative sample collection procedures do you think would work, how they would work, and, you know, that way we can hopefully make some positive changes out of all of this, and maybe make things easier for everyone to go through the testing procedures at the same time. But the current rules are there for some very good reasons. So if we're going to change anything, we also need very good reasons to move on and develop new procedures. So have a think about that. Again, just a reminder that there is a survey for everyone to complete after we close off this webinar. I'd like to say a huge thank you to James, Olivier, and Linka for your time today, and your expertise and knowledge. It's invaluable, and thank you very much. And to everyone out there, wherever you are in the world, please stay safe. You know, follow all the health rules. You know, we are getting through this pandemic, and we will get through it. And so, you know, hopefully things start to return to normal sooner rather than later. And, you know, I'm definitely looking forward to seeing many of you competing in the Olympics and Paralympics later in the year. So good luck to everyone, and stay safe, and thank you for tuning in.